The lesson I'll be teaching this morning comes from an expansion of a lesson I did at lectureship. The lectureship title for that time was Keeping Our Eyes on Jesus Christ, and being able to, despite some of the challenges that comes our way, to be able to hold our eyes unswervingly and unwaveringly on Him who's the author of our faith. In Mexico City in 1968, a man by the name of John Stephen Akwari of Tanzania started the Olympic Games marathon with other runners, and while he was running this race, he got hurt. But what also happened is that the race, in that particular race, he finished last. And he basically arrived an hour later than the one that finished the race before him. And as he arrived there, it was starting to get dark. A reporter walked up to him and said to him, "Did you not even consider at some time, due to your injuries and the lack of interest, that you might want to give up and maybe just get off the race and go home and have yourself seen to medically?" He was bleeding profusely from one wound in his leg. He also was in a lot of pain. This man was disorientated, he had leg cramps, he was fatigued, he had dehydration, and he was really struggling. And the reporter asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And he made a simple comment and he said, "My country did not send me to the Olympics to run the race, or rather to start it, but to finish it." And so often I think is that we reach times in our lives when we become exhausted. We feel tired, we become despondent. We sit with massive thoughts in our mind regarding things that are happening to friends and family, and these places us in what we can probably call faith crises. What a better book to look at is the book of Hebrews. Because you will look at the book of Hebrews, and soon it'll become evident that inside of this book, the writer of this book is trying to address the multiplicity of discouragements that comes from living the Christian life. And actually reaching a point where you could possibly even consider that this is too much for me. I've had enough. It's not an easy thing to feel discouraged, as many of you might know, and maybe this morning you are here feeling discouraged, feeling tremendously conflicted, and maybe saying that, "I can't do this. I cannot do this anymore." I want you to know the following, that this morning's lesson will hopefully mean a lot to you. If you have in any time spent time in church listening to sermons, the likelihood of Matthew 14 being preached or considered with you would be a passage when Jesus Christ calls Peter and he says to him, "Peter, come to me." I'm not going to deal that at my primary text, but I want to raise a principle in that story, is that as Peter came toward him, and by the way, is the only man in history that has been recorded to actually walking on water, he took his eyes off Jesus and he sank. And maybe this morning you are there. I'm not here to criticize you and say keep your eyes back on Jesus, but I'm going to try to hopefully sketch to you that you are just intensely human. In the story of 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 6, you don't have to turn there, but I want you to please make a note of it, because I want you to read it. It's a story of Jehoshaphat. It's a profound story because he's going to be attacked. And what he does is he struggles as any leader does, and he asks harsh questions to God. He asks him three fundamental questions. He asks him, "Are you not God?" And I want you to know that when we are going through difficult times, we ask those questions. How is it, God, that you are God and I'm sitting with a relative or a loved one that is busy dying? Many times we focus on the trauma of the event and the process of that coming to a reality than to actually think that beyond that moment there lies an eternity. But for now, he asks three questions. Are you not God? Did you not? And he points to the history that God has in the life of Israel. And then he says, he looks to the future and he says, will you not? In other words, are you not able to assist in this event that is traumatic that I'm going to be facing as the leader of this people? And we know that God actually deals with him and answers all of his prayers. I want you to know this morning that maybe this morning you have a worldview that comes from the perspective of pain. And that might capture your heart at this moment because all you can see are the waves and the wind. All you can see is failed attempts of medication. All you can see at the moment, and the very blurred, you can see Jesus there in the distance. But it doesn't make sense because your agony is just so great. I want you to know this morning, in order for you to have a clear view of who God is, you will need to look at 4 things that a biblical worldview will help you with this morning. It certainly helps me. It's crucial that in my work, I continually remind myself of a biblical worldview, not only of who Jesus is, but also how this world is structured and how it is put together and how things do unfold. We are living in a fallen world where we find that people fail, relationships fail, leaderships fail. We find economies fail. We find companies fail. And those are tough for us to get our heads around. But these 4 areas I'm going to touch on inadvertently, not specifically, is the first thing is a question that will help you. Number 1, origin. And that is, where do I come from? In the second case, what is the meaning and purpose of life? In other words, if it's true that I am on this earth, and it really is, I kill myself, and we're not like Descartes that says he woke up of a sleep on a Sunday afternoon and said, I think, therefore I am, and so on. We're talking about a consciousness that we are going through at the moment where we are aware that I'm alive, and I ask the question, Lord, if it is true that my family member is lying here, they are sick, what is this all about? In the third case, we look at morality. What is the reference then of what is right and what is wrong? In an event when we see criminality taking preference, we ask the question, Lord, does right still mean right? Is it still wrong to be corrupt? Or do we, like a Jacob Zuma would say, that it's a Western paradigm and it's not an African paradigm when we talk about corruption? In the 4th place, we will talk about destiny. And here's where the tricky things start. And here's a tricky thing, because we go into an area where no man has dominion, and only God has dominion. How will this all end? How will all of this, if I look at the tragedies of life and this fallen world in all its shapes and morphs, I can say, how is this all going to end? We come to an answer we find in the book of Hebrews. But let me further interrogate some of the questions you might want to ask this morning. What do you tell a husband when he's sitting in ICU, his wife's lying, and there's more monitors around and pipes in her body that makes sense to keep her alive? And he says the following to you, and he says to you, Dereck, it does not make sense. Because at the time of the accident, my wife was holding 2 children together. They were arguing and they were fussing and fighting. She held them together and she was praying when a truck rode over her, crushed her left rib cage. How do you explain to the world a woman that drives with bags of oranges in her car and bags of dog food, and when she sees a dog on the side of the road not having food, she will stop and put some food down for him and a bowl of water? How do you explain somebody who would drive with a bag of oranges in her car, and if she sees somebody on the side of the road, does not sit around and say, are you going to spend this money on yourself and buy alcohol? But she would stop and give them an orange to eat and say, yeah, have this. It'll quench your thirst and it'll give you temporary relief. What would you say to someone whose girlfriend or wife is lying in a hospital? She's got cancer. You cannot understand it. One moment she's declared free of cancer, the next moment it's back and virulent. You get a phone call on a Monday and saying, I'm in hospital for some checkups and some tests. On Thursday, you get a phone call and says, she's busy dying. How do you explain that? How do you explain to somebody that has just lost his job? Somebody that's faithful to God. Company say, we don't need you anymore. How do we speak to a child of 4 and explain to her that cancer is just the way it is, and that the child can hardly see you? But you hold her in your arms and you say to her that we are praying for you. And through the maze and the mist of the chemotherapy in her system, she says, thank you, Uncle D. How do you speak to a preacher that is so discouraged and tired that he wants to walk away from serving God? Or an elder or a member of the church that has dedicated their entire life to God and wants to work and do so much good, and at the moment feels, I can't do this anymore. All I get is criticism. What do you say to a person like that? And hopefully this morning the response that I'm about to give will be of help to you and to me. Because so often we forget that there is an ultimate story around all of this. The book of Hebrews is an amazing book because it speaks right in the book, chapter 12. He speaks of the idea that we're living a life, and he equates it to a race. It's not surprising that Paul would use metaphors within the context of which he lived, because he lived during the times when the Olympics was very big, during that time where he served. And so he would use this metaphor very strongly. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he would speak of, in 2 Timothy, he says, I fought the good race, I finished the course, I've kept the faith, and therefore is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who have longed for his appearing. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he speaks as well to the church, and he says to them, therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I discipline my body, and I bring it into subjection, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. A friend of mine had a Revised Standard Version, and in the Revised Standard Version it says, I buffet my body. And he often used to make the comment, he says, I buffet my body. And what Paul was saying is, he says, I constrain myself because there's something far greater about this race. Galatians 5:7, you are running a good race. Who cut into you? Who's keeping you from obeying the truth? Philippians 2:16, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run or labor in for nothing. The text I want you to look at is saying, I want you to get on this race, and I want you to run it with perseverance. I want you to get on this race, and I want you to stay in it, no matter how difficult it becomes. It's incidental that it is tough. It is incidental that you are exhausted and maybe discouraged. But the point of the matter is, what Paul is saying is, keep the main thing the main thing. Because so often you find that when you don't, you're distracted. And these things become the main event. You're dealing with your hurts and your pains and your discouragements, and that becomes the overwhelming sentiment that captures your mind and holds you back. I want you to know a few things about the original language. The word used for grace there is called agon. Interesting. It's the root form of agony. Now, I would never have guessed that. But when Paul's saying, he says, I want you to stay in there regardless of the toughness. Stay in it, because you need to get where you need to get. Where you're going to at the moment is a process that comes with running a race. When you feel like walking away from Christ and say, it does not serve my needs anymore, God is saying, I'm dealing with your spiritual needs. There's a few things I want us to know about a race. In the first place, that it's a very personal one. Despite the fact that we are functioning within a community of believers, it is an intensely personal one and an individual race. In other words, you and I run it as a team, but we also run as individuals. And Paul says to the church, let's run this race that's set before us. Many of us who have run track and field and those kind of events, you know that there's a specific a portion of the field that is demarcated just for you to run in. You step out of that race, you're in trouble and you could be disqualified. And the idea here is, what he's saying to you, keep running this race. In the second place, I want you to know that you're in a life race. And you might ask the question, life race, what does that mean? What it means is you're running for your life. There's a massive difference between a fox and a rabbit. The one is running for his meal. The other one's running for his life. And that's the difference that Paul wants us to see, is that when we are running this race, we're running for our lives. Paul would say, all are running the race, but not all will receive the crown. So run as to win. In other words, you want to run to complete the race according to God's specifications. Revelation 2:10, do not be afraid of the agony some of you will suffer, but be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. If you ask the question, how do we view death? Many of us will immediately say it's something that we don't talk about in casual conversation. But it's one of the issues that God drives into the psyche of humankind, that death is intrinsically part of being alive. And therefore then we deal with it way before it actually happens, so that when it does happen, it doesn't catch us by surprise. In the third place, Paul wants us to look at something, and he says, I want you to grasp and to grab encouragement from those who have gone before you. In other words, when we look in our community of faith, we know a lot of people who have passed on, who have died in Christ. And we look at them, and Paul says, I want you to imagine that there are a great crowd of witnesses around you, spiritually speaking. And so today, as you and I are in this building, you need to almost spiritually conceptualize and visualize that around us as a huge crowd of witnesses watching as we are fighting this race of life. And as we are going through life, know this, that you are being watched. And so often we look at that as people that are spectators, but it's not true. The word used there are people who have died for a cause greater than themselves. And the word used is martus. In other words, they're not sitting like you and I watching a game between the Bulls and Western Province and saying they should have done this, they should have done that. But in fact, it's people that have participated in that game and have excelled and have gone on. In other words, their entire view of you would be different. They're spurring you on. They're saying, go for it, stay in the match, don't give up. We watched tremendous tries yesterday, incredible game. And I want you to visualize around you now is in excess of 144 to 200 to millions upon millions. And the Bible will tell you they cannot put a number to those who have died for the cause of Christ or have died in Christ. And so Paul wants us to know that you might feel that you're alone, but he wants you to know that there are people around you, spiritually speaking, that wants you to win, that is sitting and shouting and are applauding your efforts, where only you are alone and struggling. He says, don't think that you're alone. They are watching you. They are watching you and they're encouraging you because they are familiar with the challenges that you're going through. We hear the encouragement of faith in Hebrews 11, where he speaks about Abel. Abel worshiped God, and he will tell you, worship God properly. Don't pitch up now and then when you feel like it, but make it part of your life, that it's an intentional part of my walk with God to worship with his people. Enoch will tell you that I've walked with God and I never even saw death, and I was a friend of God. Noah will tell you, don't be discouraged by your neighbors when you are building a godly household. When they are laughing and ridiculing you and saying, why do you stay married in a situation like that? The world will tell you that they function on a very a different paradigm where, well, things are just very different. Abram and Sarah will tell you, keep the faith and trust in God's promises. Joseph will tell you that as a leader, God has placed you in an environment where He wants you to be. And although it's not easy where you are, and you may have to sit in jail for 13 years for speaking the truth and being falsely accused, so be it. Because there are cause greater than that. We find Moses will saying to you, you can lead others into the promised land. He did. But he will also tell you that you need to temper your faith, your temperament. And as a leader, you need to be very careful how you conduct yourself, lest you're not allowed into the promised land yourself, physically that is. Rahab will tell you that she lived a life of immorality, and she will scream from the pages of the book of Hebrews and say, I was an ungodly woman, but God was merciful to me, and in the lineage of her life, you find the name of Jesus. You will look at the man like David, an incredible leader. And David also failed dismally, but God still speaks highly of him because he was a man after God's own heart. In the second place, I want to, just very quickly, I want to mention to you why it is so crucial for you and I to keep the main thing the main thing. Because not only is there a crowd of witnesses watching us from heaven, spiritually speaking, but there's a crowd of unbelievers around us. There's a man called Heinrich Heine, one of the foremost atheists. He was an exceptionally good argumenter. People like Christopher Hitchens was looked as a puppy in those days. But this particular man would say, I'm looking at the life of the redeemed. Let me look at your life, and hopefully I may believe your Redeemer. And so there are other people watching us, how we conduct our lives and how we behave. An elder, a man by the name of John Berry, one of the finest men that I've ever been blessed to know. He was a godly elder. We were sitting at my home and we were talking about leadership many, many years ago. In fact, he told me in a very nice way, I like your wife more than I like you. I said, oh, thank you very much. That makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. But he absolutely adored my wife. Let me tell you why he said that. He said that, you know what the problem is, Dereck, that many times because we serve in a public capacity, our wives, the one who serves probably more than we do, is often overlooked. But that's not what thrilled me about him. I wrote an email to his wife, Linda, just before he passed away, and he contracted cancer. He was in my home just when he heard his father had got cancer, and we started talking that particular day, and we prayed together, and he said, I want you to pray for me because I'm going to see my dad. And we started praying together, and he got on a plane, and he went back to America, and he wrote back to me, and probably about 6 or 8 months later, he wrote to me, and he said, Dereck, the thing that I feared the most has actually happened. I've got cancer. And we continued writing to one another, just asking how he was doing and how he was handling his life. And let me say this to you. He probably traveled more than any of us singly did in this room. But I used to get an email from him at least once a week, and some of them were like this. I'm now in the Balkans, Dereck. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate the email I received from you. I want to tell you that this morning before I lay my head down, I will be praying for you. Can I tell you what that meant as a friend? But here's the thing. He wrote back the final letter I got from him. He said, I'm being wheeled into ICU today, and I want to ask you one request. Will you pray for me that even in my dying, I will still be dignified so that the Lord will never be shamed by my lack of faith? I cannot tell you how much I cried, because that was the last letter I'd received from him. And so often when I look at how we live, even in the way that we conduct our lives, the world is watching. Secondly, You need to put away everything that hinders you. And that means you need to have a look at everything in your life that must go. And you need to make a list of those things and sins that are holding you back. Sins that constantly trap you in guilt. Let me tell you a story about a man called James Merritt. He told a story about a man who was trying to lose weight. And eventually he got this man and they were talking, and every day for a solid week he'd go to gym. End of the week he sat down with his mate. He said, I want to weigh myself, but I want to make sure that I've got nothing on me that could possibly weigh down and increase my weight. And so in the privacy of his study, he started taking off his jacket and he weighed himself. He says, man, I weigh more than I did a week ago. So the next thing he says, he took off his shirt and he took off his shoes and he stood there. He says, still not enough. And then eventually he started taking keys out of his pocket and he put those on the table. In the last, he started taking out some chocolates and some Twinkies. And he said, you want to hang on to this for now because I'm just going to weigh myself. Isn't that so interesting that we struggle to get rid of those things? That really is the cause that we are holding on to stuff. And it makes us weighty, if that makes sense. In the same way, sin calls up on us and we surround ourselves with stuff that are just weighty. What am I saying? Am I saying that we must live a life of unhappiness or live a life contextually where God has blessed us and enjoy life? I would imagine it's perspective. I love fishing. Couldn't go fishing this year at all. Unfortunately, things were just that other things had to take priority. Do we love watching television? I think it's wonderful to chill and watch an excellent game like a team like us just winning and so on. But if that comes between you and I and the Lord, and our worshiping God and being part of His family, then that becomes problematic. Right then, that has become more important than those things of taking the Lord's Supper once a week, being reminded of the community in which we function, reminded of the sacrifice that I'm enjoying this redeemed life and every blessing that comes with it. I start to lose perspective. And that's the danger. And maybe in the third place, we need to look at those things that trips us up. And what could that be? Maybe it could be a bad habit. Maybe it could be outright sin. That you and I know that is against the will of God. But you're holding on to it. The word used is a very interesting word. It's not used for something where somebody is tripped, but it's something that entangles itself and weaves its way into the fabric of your life. It's like a plant. I mean, many years ago, I think I was in Standard 2 or Standard 4, I think it is, we learned of a thing called dodder. And what it is, it's basically a creeper that finds its way into trees. And what it does is, it basically pushes into the layer of the tree and draws out the sap, ultimately causing the death of that plant. And that's the illustration. It starts to suck out the lifeblood of your life. How's about your watching funky pictures on television? How's about the computers? We've got access to so much more visual stuff that we've never had before. And so all those things just holds on to us and keeps us back from being effective. I'm going to make one illustration. And I have used it before. Many years ago, a man wrote a story and it really impacted my life. And he said sin is like this. He said many years ago he was standing at the Niagara Falls, but he was further up, close to the mountains, and he watched how all those big boulders of ice were coming down and falling into the Niagara Falls. And this particular day, he said he watched how, with the churning of the water, a fish landed up on top of the block of ice. And he said he watched how majestically this beautiful creature, a fish eagle, flew down from the mountains, swooped down, got his talons into that fish, and started gorging himself on this beautiful fresh fish. And carried on eating. But this eagle was clever. Because as he was eating this fish, he kept watching where the falls was. Because he knew if he goes there, he'll fall to his death. And so what he did was he kept munching, kept munching, kept munching. And he filled himself to capacity. And just when he thought he wanted to fly off, he thought, no, hang on a minute, stick around some more, and he ate some more. And just as he came to the edge, this big block of ice with him on it was plunging across the falls. But he still knew it's going to be okay because he could fly away at any given point in time. But this time he was judged because his feet was frozen onto that block of ice. And so often that's what happens to sin. It holds you just a bit longer than you wanted to stay. And you will tell yourself, I will get rid of this thing in my life just at this particular time. Just before I die, I will say to God, I'm going to let it go. And you may just be too late. What is he saying to us this morning? He's saying to us that you must keep running and not look around. The last point. The race, you must keep your eyes on him. The Alpha and the Omega. The one that began a good work in you, Philippians 1:6, he will finish it. He started it with you. Don't let him stop working in your life. Even in the midst of pain, let him do his work. And with perseverance, carry on doing that which is right. You must focus on the one who has finished. The founder, the designer, the pioneer, the leader, the prince, the finisher, and the ruler of this race. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Final story. In 1954, Roger Bannister set the world record, and it set the world on fire. He made a claim that everybody could never ever do before that you could run the mile in 4 minutes. In 4 minutes. And there was an Australian like Greg, John Landy, who boasted of the same and said, that's not a big deal. And so what he did was he called Roger Bannister and he says, I want to take you on publicly. Roger Bannister said, that's cool, come. And they got running. And as they started running, Landy had an incredible strategy. Get in front, stay in front, and cross the line in front. Simple, eh? And he did just that. First mile, both runners were well under the minute. Second mile, both were under 2 minutes. Third mile, both were under 3 minutes. The crowd were on their feet and they were going ape because he was going to finish up this race and it was going to be okay. And he would win. And as he came down the final stretch, he got worried and thought, I wonder about Roger, what he's up to. I wonder what he's up to. I wonder when he's going to come to try to put me at the post. And as he ran the last 20 meters, he ran and he kept going. And then he looked over his shoulder. And at that moment, Roger Bannister passed him and won the race. And maybe today you're saying to yourself, you know what? I'm going to get in this race. I'm going to stay in front and win first. Don't look over your shoulders, man. Keep going. Keep going. And maybe today you're sitting here and you're saying to yourself, but Dereck, anyone that really matters to me has passed on. I want to tell you another story. And this story is not a personal story, but is of a young man who was an average player. He played American football, and this story affected the way that I do life. It was a young man, and he used to train every week to play on the Saturday. But he just wasn't good enough. His size was not big enough. He wasn't fast enough. And what happened was his father came with him every single practice session and would sit on the bench and would watch his son practice. This particular Saturday, they were playing a very big game. And he spoke to his coach and he said, Coach, please, you've got to give me the chance to play. And the coach said to him, man, you know what? We can't afford it. The stakes are too high. And he said, Coach, I promise you, I won't disappoint you. And he started playing the game. The coach says, Ahman, suit up and let's get going. And he got onto the field and he played like a man possessed. He played perfectly, passed perfectly. He ran like the wind. And they were well ahead in the game. And finally they won the match. And here's the kicker. When they came to the end of the game, he went into the change rooms and he just sat there with his head between his hands, with his towel over his head. They carried him in and they shouted his praises because he did well and they won. And then the coach asked him, what made you play so well? He said, Coach, my dad died last night. My father was with me every single practice session. And my father was blind. He never saw me play. He never watched me play, but Dad always supported me. He always shouted, you can do better, my boy. And he says, for 2 seasons, all I did was I sat on the bench. But Dad believed in me. And last night, Dad passed away, and Dad's in heaven now. And according to 1 Corinthians 15, he will be able to see fully again with his spiritual body. And he says, knowing my dad, he would be standing there watching me and be shouting for me every step of the way and saying, go for it, my boy. Play hard, get in there, throw your weight at it. Yes, you're bleeding. Yes, it's sore. Yes, people disappoint. Yes, there's pain. But he'll be shouting for me. And he says, Coach, I played for the audience of one for my dad. And that's why I hang in there. It doesn't matter who thinks what. In the same way today, I'm saying to you, you might feel broken. You might feel discouraged. But when you take everything else out the picture, you play and you run this race of life to the audience of one. If you can find a why, you can overcome anything. Jesus Christ is the why. He says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I've called you, I've started you off, and I will finish it at the proper time. You keep your eyes on me, it's going to be okay. Might be painful now, but it won't carry on for long. And then this will be a memory. Today, if you feel discouraged, today, if you need the prayers of the church, I pray that you don't sit there, but come and let us pray with you. Let the elders pray for you. Let them encourage you so that you can know that you're not alone.